What if the person you trusted the most, the one who stood beside you every Sunday, leading the congregation in song and prayer, was hiding a secret so horrifying it could shatter your entire world? What if your spouse, the person you thought you knew inside and out, was living a double life, one that would lead to death and destruction? This is the story of a small town in Florida, a seemingly perfect family, and a betrayal that would cost a life. A young choir member, full of ambition and promise, was brutally murdered. Her body was found discarded like trash, dumped in the cold waters of a river. The shocking truth? It was her best friend's husband, the church pastor, whose affair with the victim would spark an unimaginable tragedy. But it wasn't just the affair that led to the crime. No, it wasn't the affair at all that caused the death of 23-year-old Rebecca Johnson. It was something else. A simple message, a text on a phone, something so small, yet it would unravel everything. Rebecca had no idea that when she sent that message, she would seal her fate. She had no way of knowing that one text would put her in the crosshairs of a woman desperate to protect her family's perfect image. A woman who was willing to go to any lengths to keep her life from falling apart. What started as a moment of betrayal would become a carefully planned execution. Rebecca would never see it coming. And it all began with a single text. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate it. Thank you. Rebecca Johnson was the kind of person everyone admired. At 23, she had a bright future ahead of her, and her voice was a gift to anyone who heard it. A member of the local choir at St. Mark's Church, Rebecca was known for her talent, her kind heart, and her unshakable faith. She was one of those people you couldn't help but like. Sweet, warm, and always ready to lend a hand or a listening ear. Her passion for music was matched only by her love for the church and her belief in the power of community. But all of that would come to an end on a cold night in early February, when Rebecca's body was discovered in a remote part of the river. What no one knew, at that moment, was that her tragic death was the result of a deadly game of secrets, lies, and betrayal that had been playing out quietly in the shadows for months. Pastor Mark Hughes had been the spiritual leader of St. Mark's Church for nearly a decade. At 45, he was a pillar of the community, respected, admired, and well-liked by all who knew him. He had a family, a beautiful wife, 2 children, and an image that was virtually untouchable. In the eyes of the congregation, Pastor Mark was a man of integrity, a man of faith. His words in the pulpit were powerful, his presence commanding. He made people feel safe, reassured, like nothing bad could ever touch their town, their church. But as perfect as Pastor Mark appeared to be on the surface, something was off. Few knew that his marriage to Linda, a woman who was 10 years his junior, was anything but flawless. While they presented themselves as the picture of a perfect couple, behind closed doors, the reality was very different. Mark's calm demeanor hid a well of frustration, and Linda's sharp, sometimes icy persona masked a deep, seething anger that no one could quite place. And that anger, it seemed, was rooted in something far more personal than anyone knew. Something that, for the longest time, Linda had kept locked away, until one text message brought it all into the light. Linda Hughes was a striking woman, tall, graceful, and with an air of authority that commanded respect. She had been by her husband's side throughout his rise in the church, supporting him in every way possible. But as the years passed, Linda began to feel as though she was fading into the background. Her life had been spent in the service of her husband, her family, and her church, but there was something inside her that was slowly burning, a feeling of being trapped. She wasn't the young woman who had married Mark all those years ago. She was now a wife, a mother, and a woman who had become invisible in her own life. It wasn't long before Linda's jealousy and suspicion began to surface. She noticed the way Pastor Mark would look at Rebecca when she sang in the choir. She saw the extra attention he paid her, the quiet conversations that seemed a little too friendly, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long. And it wasn't just the pastor's behavior that troubled Linda. Rebecca had become a trusted friend, someone Linda had come to rely on. Their friendship in the beginning had been innocent, but it was no secret that as Rebecca and Mark grew closer, Linda began to feel a knot tighten in her chest. One night, after a long day at church, Linda found herself going through her husband's phone. She didn't expect to find anything, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then she saw it. A text message that would change everything. The message was short, almost innocuous, but to Linda, it was the confirmation she'd been waiting for, the proof of her worst fear. It was a message from Rebecca to Mark. In it, Rebecca asked him if he was still thinking about that night. First, Linda froze. Her heart raced, her hands trembled. But she wasn't imagining things. It was real. There was no denying it anymore. Her husband had been having an affair with Rebecca. The weight of that revelation hit Linda like a ton of bricks. The anger she had been keeping hidden suddenly erupted. She confronted Mark, but he denied it. Denied the affair, denied any wrongdoing. But Linda knew. She knew the truth now. It was too late for denial, too late for apologies. In the days that followed, Linda became increasingly erratic. Her suspicions turned into something far darker. What was once a quiet, seething rage began to turn into something she couldn't control. She knew that Rebecca had to be silenced. Her mind became fixated on the idea that Rebecca was the one thing standing between her and a perfect life again. And what she failed to see was that her obsession with Rebecca was pushing her further into a corner where the only way out was through violence. Rebecca, meanwhile, had no idea what was coming. She continued to sing in the choir, continued to offer her friendship to Linda, never knowing that every word she spoke, every smile she shared, was pushing her closer to the edge of a deadly game. What started as a simple friendship between a pastor's wife and a young choir member soon became the perfect storm. A storm that, no matter how hard they tried to avoid it, would soon tear them all apart. It would all come to a head one fateful night when Linda finally decided to act. The tension had been building for months, and now the unthinkable would happen. Rebecca would never make it out alive. It all started with a text message. Linda had never thought she would find herself in this position. She had married Mark with the belief that their love was unshakable, that nothing, not even the temptations of the outside world, could break their bond. But when she picked up his phone that night, everything she thought she knew about her life and her marriage came crashing down in an instant. It was the message that changed everything. The text was from Rebecca. It wasn't anything overtly explicit at first glance, but Linda knew what it meant. The words were vague, a mere hint at something that had been hidden, something that had been quietly growing behind her back. The text read, "I still remember that night. Are we really going to keep this a secret forever?" Linda's heart skipped a beat as she read it again, the meaning sinking in deeper. The betrayal was clear now. There was no denying it. Mark had been having an affair with Rebecca. The woman she had welcomed into her home, the young girl she had tried to guide, was the one who had stolen her husband's affections. Her world froze. The phone slipped from her hands and she stared at the screen, struggling to breathe. For a few moments, Linda felt as though everything was spinning. Was this really happening? She thought back to the late nights Mark had spent away from home, the moments of silence between them that she dismissed as stress or exhaustion. All of it came rushing back now. Nothing had been an accident. It had all been a lie. In the days that followed, Linda tried to process the unimaginable pain. But there was no way to forget the betrayal. No way to look at Rebecca the same way again. The more Linda thought about it, the more obsessed she became. She replayed that text message over and over, each time her rage growing more intense. How could Rebecca have done this to her? How could she betray her trust, be so shameless? And as Linda's mind twisted with these thoughts, she started to look at her husband with a new hatred, one that she had never felt before. Mark's indifference, his refusal to admit the truth, made her feel even more isolated, even more helpless. Every interaction with him felt like a lie. Linda couldn't escape the thoughts that consumed her every waking moment. She became obsessed with the idea of Rebecca and Mark together, how they had been sneaking around behind her back, how they had shared intimate moments while she was in the dark. And that image of them together started to eat away at her, turning her mind into a battlefield where only revenge could offer solace. What could she do to make it stop? How could she regain control of the situation she had no power over? The answer came to her in the quietest of moments, when the house was still, when she could think without anyone watching. She needed to confront Rebecca. She needed to let her know what she had done to her, what she had done to her family. But as Linda's thoughts turned darker, she began to see that this wasn't just about confronting Rebecca anymore. No, this wasn't going to be about a simple confrontation. She wanted to make sure Rebecca never threatened her life again. It was clear to Linda now this wasn't just a betrayal. This wasn't just about Mark and Rebecca. This was about her life, her pride, and her sense of control. The jealousy, the rage, those emotions twisted inside her. Her feelings of humiliation only made the anger grow stronger. She became fixated on the idea of making Rebecca pay. But it wasn't enough to just tell Rebecca how she felt. No, Linda needed something more, something final, something that would erase the possibility of Rebecca ever interfering again. As Linda's mind worked through her plan, every moment she spent with Mark only made her more furious. His indifference, his failure to confess or even show genuine remorse, fed her frustration. He was slipping away from her, emotionally at least, and Linda could no longer sit in silence, pretending everything was okay. He didn't seem to care that he had betrayed her. He didn't seem to care that their entire world was falling apart. The rage Linda had tried to contain finally reached a boiling point. She couldn't hide it anymore. She couldn't swallow it down. The only thing that made sense now was action. If Mark wouldn't fix things, she would. If Rebecca wouldn't stay away, Linda would make sure she never had a chance to come between them again. Linda's anger became her obsession. She no longer saw Rebecca as a person. She was an obstacle, a thing that had to be removed. And the more Linda thought about it, the more she realized that what she was about to do wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about regaining control over her life. The truth was, Linda couldn't let go. She could no longer live with the fact that Rebecca had taken something from her, her trust, her marriage, her sense of security. And that rage? It was all-consuming, overpowering her every decision. And it wasn't long before Linda made a decision that would seal Rebecca's fate forever. She would confront her. She would make Rebecca feel the consequences of her actions. No one was going to take her life, her family, or her future away from her, not without paying the price. Linda knew it had to happen. After weeks of obsessing over the betrayal, after allowing the anger to consume her every thought, Linda had made up her mind. Rebecca had to be silenced permanently. It wasn't just about protecting her marriage anymore, it was about reasserting control over a life that had been slipping away from her. And the way Linda saw it, Rebecca had left her with no choice. But Linda wasn't reckless. She wasn't about to make a mistake now, not after everything had built up to this point. She knew exactly what she was doing. The church, the place where everything had started, the place where Rebecca had sung with such passion, the place where Linda had first come to trust her, would be the perfect setting for what Linda was about to do. It was a familiar place, one that would allow Linda to feel in control, to stage the entire confrontation without anyone suspecting a thing. So she made sure Rebecca would be there that night. She knew Rebecca's routine, knew when she would be at the church for practice, when the choir would be rehearsing, and when things would be quiet enough for a private conversation. Linda called Rebecca, asking her to meet in the church sanctuary under the guise of discussing choir matters. Rebecca, never one to turn down a request, agreed without hesitation. Linda was already waiting when Rebecca arrived. The church was empty, save for the faint sound of a few distant voices from the choir room. The tall, stained-glass windows cast long shadows across the wooden pews, and the air felt thick with the weight of silence. Rebecca walked in, oblivious to the danger that awaited her. She smiled, thinking nothing of it, unaware that Linda had already decided how the night would end. As Rebecca approached, Linda greeted her with a practiced calmness. Her voice was steady, almost too steady, as she gestured for Rebecca to sit. But Linda had no intention of talking about choir rehearsals that night. What she wanted to do was make Rebecca understand the depth of the betrayal. And so she let the words spill out, harsh, cutting, filled with venom. She told Rebecca how she had known about the affair, how she had seen the texts, how the lies had torn apart her world. Rebecca's eyes widened with shock. She tried to apologize, tried to explain that it had never meant to go this far, that it had just been a mistake. But Linda wasn't listening. The words that Rebecca spoke only seemed to fuel Linda's anger even more. She could hear Rebecca's voice, pleading, but it didn't matter. The rage that had been building for weeks reached its boiling point. In one violent, chaotic moment, Linda struck. It wasn't planned, not in the way Linda had thought it would be. She had thought she could control her emotions, but in the heat of the moment, all that mattered was ending Rebecca's life, shutting her up, making sure she would never hurt her again. With a sudden, swift motion, Linda reached for the nearby blunt instrument she had hidden earlier, a metal candlestick, cold and heavy in her hand. Rebecca didn't even see it coming. Before she could react, Linda brought it down with all the force she had inside her. The sound was muffled by the thick carpet beneath them, but it was enough to silence Rebecca's cries. Linda stood over her, breathless, heart pounding, her hands trembling. Rebecca lay motionless on the floor, her body crumpled, lifeless. It was over. But Linda's chilling plan was far from finished. She had known from the beginning that there could be no trace left behind. No signs, no evidence, no way for anyone to connect her to the crime. The body couldn't just be left in the church. Linda had prepared for this moment long before that night, and she had already decided where it would go. The river. The place where she could be sure no one would ever find Rebecca's body. With cold, calculated precision, Linda dragged Rebecca's lifeless form out of the church. The sanctuary, the place that had once been a symbol of peace and faith, became the scene of a horrifying crime. She moved quickly, her heart racing, but her mind sharp. No one could see her. No one could stop her. She stuffed Rebecca's body into the trunk of her car, trying to block out the weight of what she had just done. The river was only a short drive away. It felt like the longest journey of her life, but Linda pushed all thoughts of regret aside. She had to finish this. When she arrived at the river's edge, the night was thick with fog. The only sound was the distant murmur of the water flowing beneath the bridge. Linda opened the trunk and stared down at the body. She felt nothing. Not fear, not guilt, not relief. Just an overwhelming need to dispose of the evidence. She didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, she pulled Rebecca's body out of the trunk, dragging it to the water's edge, and with one final push, shoved it into the cold current. The body sank quickly, disappearing into the murky depths. Linda stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet ripples in the water. And then, without another thought, she turned and left. It was done. Rebecca's body was now lost to the river, drifting away in the darkness. No one would ever know what had really happened to her. Not for a long time, at least. Linda had taken every precaution. No one could tie her to the crime. No one would know the truth. And with that, Linda returned to her life, carrying the weight of her actions in the most terrifying way by pretending nothing had changed. But there was one question that lingered, one question that Linda couldn't shake. Would anyone ever find out? Days passed before the body was discovered. Rebecca's body, now a lifeless weight in the river, was carried downstream, its current finally depositing it near the edge of town. A fisherman out on his early morning route made the grim discovery. It was the beginning of a dark chapter for this quiet Florida town. The police investigation began in earnest. Detectives combed through the scene, examining the body for clues and piecing together the fragments of Rebecca's final days. They found a few key items, scraps of torn clothing, and, crucially, a single phone. It was Rebecca's. As they sifted through her messages, one text stood out above the rest. I still remember that night. Are we really going to keep this a secret forever? The text led them to a tangled web of relationships, a young choir member and a married pastor with a wife who would do anything to protect her perfect life. Suspicion quickly turned to Linda. The more the detectives dug, the more they began to focus on Linda. There were inconsistencies in her alibi, and her behavior had been strangely distant after Rebecca's disappearance. Everyone had seen her as the perfect pastor's wife, but now her perfect life was looking more and more like a well-crafted facade. Could it be? Could Linda, the one who had everything to lose, be capable of such a heinous act? As the investigation deepened, it became clear all roads led back to her. It came in the dead of night. Linda was arrested, not with the commotion or chaos you might expect from a dramatic television scene, but with the quiet finality of a life unraveling. Officers arrived at her home in the early hours, knocking on the door, their faces unreadable. Linda, still in her pajamas, opened the door without hesitation. Her arrest was swift, no struggle, no denial. She was cuffed and led out, her expression blank, her movements stiff. She didn't cry out. She didn't beg for mercy. There was no apology, no regret. The woman who had once played the role of the perfect wife, the perfect mother, was now walking out of her home in handcuffs, charged with a brutal crime. But even though she gave nothing away, there was a truth that seemed to linger in the air, one that no words could deny. She knew what she had done. And deep down, maybe she knew she'd have to answer for it. The courtroom became a battleground. The trial that followed was a spectacle in its own right, a clash between cold facts and emotional defenses. Linda's lawyers tried to paint her as a victim of circumstance, claiming the affair had driven her to madness, to a state where she could no longer distinguish right from wrong. They argued that her actions, though horrific, were the result of intense emotional turmoil. How many of us, the defense attorney pleaded, could handle the betrayal of someone we loved so dearly? How far would you go to protect what you built? They tried to make the case that Linda's motive was rooted in heartbreak, not malice. But the prosecution countered Linda didn't just lose her temper. She planned. She executed. She disposed of the body. And the text messages between Rebecca and her husband? Those weren't just an affair, they were the key that unlocked a chilling reality. The emotional toll was staggering. For the congregation, the betrayal was nearly impossible to comprehend. A woman they had trusted, a woman who had once stood beside her husband, leading the church, now sat on trial for the most heinous of crimes. The pastor's flock was torn apart. Some stood by Linda, believing in her innocence, hoping against hope that anything could explain away the horror. Others couldn't shake the image of their former pastor's wife as a cold-blooded killer. And for Rebecca's family, the trial was another wave of grief. Their daughter, their sister, their friend gone forever, and now they had to endure the public scrutiny, the courtrooms, the endless questions. No amount of legal battles could bring Rebecca back, and that was the hardest truth of all. Every day as the trial progressed, they sat in silence, their pain growing with each new revelation. The loss of Rebecca was unbearable, and now the injustice seemed to cut even deeper. Linda's arrest and trial had torn apart more than just her family, it had shattered the entire community. And with the trial's end, no one would leave unchanged. Linda might have thought she could control the narrative, but in the end, the truth could not be hidden forever. The trial was nearing its end, but just as it seemed Linda's fate was sealed, something unexpected happened. As Linda sat in the courtroom awaiting the final moments of her trial, a new development shocked everyone. A surprise witness came forward, someone no one had anticipated. It was an old friend of Pastor Mark's, someone who had kept a long-held secret until now. It was revealed that Pastor Mark, the very man Linda had once pledged her life to, had known about the affair all along. The courtroom went silent. No one knew how to process it. Mark hadn't just been a passive observer to the breakdown of his marriage, he had been a participant, a willing participant in the betrayal of his wife and the devastation of Rebecca's life. He had known about the affair, he had lied to cover it up, and perhaps most chilling of all, he had never once confessed to his role in the tragedy. But was Mark more than just an accomplice in a tragic love triangle? Some believed that Mark had been too weak to stand up to Linda, that he was as much a victim as Rebecca, manipulated by a woman who controlled everything around her. Others wondered, had he, too, been involved in the planning? Was it possible that Linda's actions had been spurred on, even encouraged, by her husband's own guilt and indifference? And with this revelation, the case took on a new dimension. Questions that had been left unanswered suddenly demanded answers. Was Linda's rage truly the driving force behind Rebecca's murder, or had Pastor Mark, knowingly or unknowingly, played a larger role in the destruction of a young woman's life? The trial concluded, but the story wasn't over. Linda was sentenced to life in prison, a tragic end to what had begun as a seemingly perfect life. But even as the gavel came down, the case left far more questions than answers. Was Linda the mastermind, acting purely out of jealousy and revenge? Or had the pastor's affair been the catalyst for a much darker series of events? As Linda was escorted away, the eyes of the world watched, but the most troubling question remained unanswered. Was this truly a crime of passion? Or was there something far more complicated, something deeper, lurking beneath the surface? And as the story closes, we're left to wonder. What really happened that night in Florida? Was Linda's crime born of rage and betrayal? Or was she, too, a victim of a marriage bound by deceit, manipulation, and lies? Could Pastor Mark have been pulling the strings all along? Or was Linda simply the puppet caught in a web far beyond her control? If you want to hear more true crime stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. You don't want to miss the shocking details in our next video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think really happened that night? Was Linda the mastermind, or was Pastor Mark hiding something even darker?